Hi everyone, happy International Women's Day and welcome to another session from No Tech Now. I am really glad to be part of this celebration and bring you one more topic, this time on Android animations with MotionLayout. A little about me, my name is Layale. I'm joining you from Lebanon. I'm a software engineer and I'm currently part of Neo Technologies Android team. And today, I am here to talk about building practical animations in Android with MotionLayout. So you may ask, why animations? Why do we need animations? Well, animations are a great way to enhance an app experience. So we can use animations to show changes. Animating between states lets the user naturally track changes in our UI. We can draw attention using animations to draw attention to important UI elements on our screens. And of course, building beautiful designs. Because effective motion and design makes apps look polished. So let's get started. Today, we are going to dive into how we can use MotionLayout with the motion editor. And you will discover how really easy it is and practical to work with. So don't worry if you haven't used MotionLayout before, because hopefully by the end of the session, you will have a good understanding of how to get started and build beautiful animations for your apps. So what is MotionLayout? MotionLayout is a layout type based on ConstraintLayout. So it supports all the same features of ConstraintLayout. So if you are using constraints that are part of ConstraintLayout, like barriers and chains, they can be also part of MotionLayout. In addition to that, MotionLayout allows to easily coordinate animations of multiple views on the screen. So usually we are used to use transition managers to make simple view animations, but MotionLayout aims to manage complex animations driven by interaction. So for example, if you want to drag a certain view or click on a button and move different views in different directions at the same time, MotionLayout is the answer. So it's like we are transitioning a complete scene and not just a single item. One of the nicest parts of MotionLayout is that it supports seekable and reversible animations. So you have the ability to seek to a certain position of an animation, not like other fire and forget types of animations, where when it starts, you can stop it. This is one more advantage of MotionLayout. And another thing is that the MotionLayout is compatible back to API level 14, which should cover most of the use cases of today's applications. Now, what is Motion Editor? Motion Editor is a new animation tool that is built into Android Studio. Be aware that it only works with version 4.0 and above. So MotionLayout makes it easier to build, edit, and preview animations as we are developing them. And just note that I am currently using ConstraintLayout 2.0.4 and Android Studio 4.1. So let's get started. The first thing that you want to do, or make sure that you already have, is to have added the latest version of ConstraintLayout in Gradle. And the latest version that I'm using now is 2.0.4. You might want to check if this is still the latest version on your side by the time you're watching this video. So just double check. The simplest way to create a motion layout is by using Android Studio. So as you can see here, we have a layout using ConstraintLayout. And it has a simple icon in the middle that we will be animating at this presentation. And we want to convert this constraint layout to a motion layout. So what we do is we go into Android Studio. On the design surface, We right-click on the preview and we will see Convert to Motion Layout. A dialog will pop up on the screen letting us know that we will convert to a motion layout and create a motion scene file. Now, if we go back and look at the XML, we will see that the constraint layout tag has been changed to a motion layout tag. And there is also a layout description attribute that was added, which points to the motion scene file that Android Studio just added for us. So moving over this motion scene. The motion scene file is an XML file. So you will be able to find it in your app/res/XML folder. It contains multiple states and transitions between them. So in other words, it defines all the animations for this particular scene or layout that we have here. And it can be also defined programmatically, so you can be able to create it in Kotlin or in Java if you want to. But now we will stick to using it in XML. So what are the components of a motion scene? A motion scene contains a lot of tags, so it can be confusing if you look at all of them at the same time. What I recommend is starting out with 2 to 3 basic tags, and then slowly start to look at different tags that you can add to make your animation a richer animation. So what you see on the screen is typically what a motion scene file contains. We have the top level motion scene tag. We have a transition tag. Inside the transition, we have a KeyFrameSet, an on-click listener, or an on-swipe listener. And then we also have the constraint sets. A motion scene can contain different constraint sets. We will talk about these in a few. And each constraint has different constraints, and each is applied to a different view. And that constraint can have different things on it, like transformation, a property set, a layout, a custom attribute. So these are the ones that I will be focusing on to get you started. And we will go a little bit deeper while using the motion editor at the end. So let's look at constraint sets and what they actually mean inside the motion scene. We are used to have constraints in the constraint layout. We usually define these inline within the views using attributes like align bottom to, align top to, etc. In motion layout, we extract all of those constraints and put them into constraint sets in this separate motion scene file. And obviously, a constraint set is basically all of those constraints, sizes, and other attributes for all the views in our layout defined within a set. Now, if we go into the motion scene file, we can see that Android Studio created 2 constraint sets for us. One is labeled start and one is labeled end. Here, both constraint sets start and end are empty. So it will use the constraints from the layout that we defined at the start. Constraint sets represent a static positioning of all the views in a motion layout. So for example, in the constraint set start, we will have positioning information of our views at the start of a certain animation. And the constraint set end, we will have the final position of these views after this animation. So we like to think of constraint set as a state. We here have 2 states, state start and a state end. And as we can see here, the end state has the constraints of this image in this specific state. In addition to the constraints that are similar to the ones we use in ConstraintLayout, we have different tags that can go into this constraint tag. For example, the one we are using here is transform. We can use this attribute to make rotations and translations In this case, as you can see, the position of the image won't change since the layout attributes will still be derived from the start. They're still coming from the same previous state. But as you can see, the image has rotated, and this is how it will look like at the end state. So by doing this, we can define multiple constraint sets, multiple states, and transition between them. Talking about transition, all motion layout animations are transitions between states. So we model those states as constraint sets, and we use the transition tag to define and customize those transitions. In our example, our motion scene has a transition between two constraint sets. The transition tag typically defines the start and end constraint sets, and other attributes as well, like the duration, which is the duration of the animations in milliseconds. We can have multiple transitions between multiple states in a motion scene file. With this code here, we have defined the start state and the end state, and automatically the system will take the most appropriate transition between them. All we have to do, define the different states, and MotionLayout will transition between them. So there are many attributes for the transition tag. We have already talked about the duration. Let's explore two more, auto transition and motion interpolator. First, we will talk about auto transition. This is a powerful attribute that allows you to have automatic behavior when reaching a certain state. One of the most common use cases we use it for is when we create animations that trigger when launching a view. To do this, we just add the attribute auto transition to the transition. Here we are setting it to animate to end, and that's it. This animation will start as soon as the view is loaded. Next, we will talk about motion interpolator. This attribute allows us to control the acceleration during the transition. This is usually called easing. You can either use one of the predefined interpolators like ease out, ease in, or bounce, like the one we are seeing on the screen. Or you can pre-reference a custom animation that you created for your project. Now let's talk about the on-click tag. A lot of common motion layout animations involve swiping gestures. We can also try a lot of interesting animations by clicking elements on the screen. So typically, there are 4 ways to trigger a transition in motion layout. Either automatically, programmatically, or using the on-click and on-swipe tags. Some of these transitions I already covered before, for example, automatically transitioning to a next state. Transitions can also be done programmatically. For example, a certain change in your program can be reflected by a transition to another state. For example, you can trigger animation when you connect to the database, for example. You can do this with code. Then there is the on-click tag inside the transition tag. There are 2 ways to trigger a transition with on-click. I can have an empty on-click tag, and the animation will trigger wherever I click on the motion layout. This can be useful when using a motion layout that lay out one component, like a button, for example. But the most common way is to add a target ID attribute to the on-click tag. So once the user clicks on the widget with this ID, the transition is started. We can have many on-clicks for many transitions in a motion scene file. Now let's look at KeyFrameSets. A keyframe lets you modify the path, the alpha or other attributes of a view as it is transitioning from start to end. So a keyframe is like a key point that modifies this transition. And a keyframe set is like a timeline of different events that goes from the start till the end. Let's explore how to use these keyframes to modify a path by adding rotations, translations, to change the path of a single view that it moves across the screen. Let's say, for example, I have a button that transitions from position 1 to position 2. During this transition, and at 60% of the path, I want the button to disappear. So I want its alpha to become 0. So here we have a key attribute. This key attribute takes the motion target that defines the view of the many views associated with this change. The frame position defines where along the animation this change takes place. So it can be one of 101 position, from 0% to 100%. Here it's set to 60%. And I set its alpha to 0. An important thing to mention is that those keyframes do not change the start state and the end state. It only changes the path between them at a certain position. So this allows us to trigger certain things at certain points of our animation. So these keyframes or key attributes, or later on we will see key positions, can be combined and can be complex and powerful ways to create amazing animations for your application. So in general, these are the key concepts of using the motion layout. So we have our constraint sets, our transitions, and our keyframe sets. The motion editor allows us to visualize those animations, and it can be very helpful because it allows us to edit and preview the motion scene files that we have. And this makes it extremely powerful and a lot easier to work with motion layouts. So let's move to Android Studio and try it there together. So now that we are in Android Studio, let's get started. I have already prepared a constraint layout file that has a few views that I would like to animate on the screen. The first thing that I want to do is convert this constraint layout to a motion layout. To do that, I will go to the design surface, right-click on the preview and select Convert to Motion Layout. When I convert it, and as I have my motion layout, the motion editor will open. Before we dive into the motion editor, let's look at the code and what changed in the XML file when we convert it to a motion layout. At the top, the tag motion constraint layout changed to a motion layout. And we have a file that has been added by Android Studio, which is the motion scene. And we have a file that has been added to our project, which is the motion scene. The motion scene is the description of all the animations that this motion layout uses. So if we go into this motion scene file, we can see that Android Studio created two constraint sets for us, one labeled start and one labeled end. And because these constraint sets are empty, this means that it will use the constraints that are defined in the layout. This file has also a transition tag. This transition tag means this is how the animation will work. So it has a start and end that determine it. It also runs in 1 second, so the duration between the start and end will be 1 second. We also have the KeyFrameSet that we will check in a few. So as you can see, this is our motion scene file. If we go back to our motion editor, we can see that it visually represents all the contents of the motion scene in this motion editor. So we have our constraint sets in the components and overview panel. We can click on one of the elements. For example, I would click on the motion layout, and we can preview what views we have in it and the constraints in the motion layout XML file. If we click on one of the views, we will be able to edit its constraints in the right attributes panel. We can add and change constraints of these views. And this right attributes panel will update to show the attributes and constraints of the currently selected view. So for example, if I go and select the constraint set end, we will see the attributes of this constraint set. We don't have a lot of attributes for the constraint set end, but the key point here is that you can see that the motion editor is mapped one-to-one with the motion scene XML file. So whenever you change something in the motion editor, it will be changed in the XML motion scene file. Let's go back and click on the constraint set start, and we will see these views here. We can see that because it's empty, it takes the layout from the source itself. The source will be from the layout, motion layouts that we already defined. So if we want to change, for example, let's go and change the end start state. So if we want to create a certain constraint on this image and move it from its place at the end state, we can create a constraint by clicking on this pencil icon and selecting Create Constraint. You can, as soon as possible, see that it changed. So the layout is now starting from the end constraint set, and we have a check that says that this view is constrained in the constraint set end. So because motion editor copies all the layout from our motion layout file, we can go and check that we can change the constraint of this view in the constraint set end. So for example, I will put it on the right side of the screen, so it will move horizontally. Now we can check the transition between them by clicking on this arrow that points from start to end. When we click on this arrow, we can see the playback controls for this transition. It has a scrub bar that we can use to be able to seek to a certain position inside our animation. So it makes it easier to debug and see what's happening in our animation. And when we click on the play button, we can see that now we are changing from start state to end state with the predefined and most appropriate transition between them. So let's say we want to add some more exciting animation. So we want to add something to our constraint set end. We want this animation to end with much bigger, with a more scaled icon. So what we do is we click on this constraint end, we click on our view, and we can scroll to the transforms view. And we can here change the scale X to double it and have it bigger, and scale Y as well. We can also make it fade and make it disappear by reaching the end state. So let's look again at what we changed. We can see that it's doubling the size and disappearing as soon as it reached the end state. Now, if we want to add something that changes transformation on the path without changing the start or the end, we can use our keyframe sets. For example, let's add some rotation. So I want to make this icon at 50% of the animation rotate to be in a 90 degrees position. So to do this, we click on the transition because the keyframe set is part of the transition. And then we click on this icon right here and select key attribute. When I select key attribute, I will define which view I like to animate in this key attribute change. I will select my view, my image view, and I will pose the position to 50%, and I will select the attribute to have it as a rotation. And once I add it, you can see this diamond point here that says that at 50%, we will have something that changes our path from start to end. So now we defined our rotation, but we didn't change the angle. So by default, it says 45%, 45 degrees. I will put it to 90 degrees. And now, if we click on the play button, we can see that it's rotating at 50% and then readjusting till the end position. Now, let's look at the XML file to see what really changed when we edited in the motion editor. If we go back to our motion scene file, we can see that in our transition, we have added the keyframe set, that is the motion target, our image, the keyframe position, and the rotation. And in the ConstraintSet end, we have added the constraints with the scale, with the alpha, and you can see that Motion Editor adds them in the XML file in order, in the same order that we added them ourselves. Now, if we go back and add some more exciting animation in our example, for example, we want this animation to start by clicking on the image view. So to do that, we will go to our transition, we select it, and we click to add a click handler. When we select it, we define that the transition will go from start to end, and by clicking on which view, on the image view. And once we add this, we will have our animation start by clicking. So we will run it and see it in a few. So as you can see, these are the basic elements of our animation. And of course, we can add different states in our animation. So if we want to add another constraint set, we can click on the overview panel and create constraint set. We can, for example, give it a name like final, the final state, and we can create a certain constraint set based on either the motion layout or other constraint set that we previously defined. Here, I will just use the motion layout. And once I do this, you can see that we have an additional state that has been added to our overview panel, the final. Now, if we want to change what are the positions of the images at the final state, we can, for example, select our image view and create a constraint. And now you can see that it has the final source, that it is defined in the final constraint set. And I would like to make this transition and put this view at the top of the screen. So it will go up. So now you can now know that to have an animation, we should have two states and a transition between them. So what I will do is I will go from the end state where we did end in our animation and then go to the final state. So to add a transition, we can click on this button and we can say the start will be the end state and the end will be the final state. We can also say that we want it to be automatic. So once we launch this view, it will appear and it will start. The animation will start. I will leave it as it is and I will add it. And as soon as I add it, I can see that the arrow has been created for the transition between the end and final constraint set. And if we click on play, we can see that it moves and it converts into what the state and the final state is. So as you can see, you can add any complex animation that you want, but these are the basics. We have states that are constraint sets. We have the transitions. You can trigger them automatically or by clicking on them. And on these animations, we can set key points that change the path during the transition. And this is how you build those complex animations. So I hope this session really helped you learn about motion layout, and I look forward to see what you create with motion layout. You can tag me or DM me at Matta on Twitter. See you.